Okay, we're back, we're live. We're here with ThinkTech Global on a given Monday. And we have a special guest who joins us by Skype from Washington, D.C., our old friend, Russell Kekoa Koehler. Thank you for joining us, Russell.
I'm glad to be here.
We are so interested in talking to you. The view of Europe and the Middle East from Washington. And you just recently got back from Turkey, where you were engaged in academic and think tank pursuits in Istanbul. And you had a whole network there, and we want to, capitalize on that, because I understand you're still in touch with the people you were dealing with in Istanbul, and there's a lot happening, obviously, in the region. One thing, let me just preface by saying, the world is now watching ISIS. And of course, ISIS, for reasons that I'd like to ask you about, wants that. And so they killed 130 people thereabouts in Paris 10 days ago, and have made various threats since then. And we will get no rest. I'm not sure when this will all be over either. This is the new normal, it looks like, which is a horrible thing to say. But we need to study it. We need to get, a reality test on it from you and other correspondents. And so we're delighted that we can talk to you. So going first to, I guess the thing that touches me in terms of your contact with the Middle East, your most recent contact with the Middle East, was in Turkey. And this morning I got news email suggesting there was a soccer match, actually more than one soccer match, at which it was planned to have a moment of silence. In the one case for the people who were killed in Paris, and in the other case, I think there was some other incident over the last few days, involving the killing of some Kurds, was it? I don't recall. And there was supposed to be a moment of silence for them too. But the crowd didn't go silent. The crowd booed when it was asked to engage in a moment of silence. And this, I made a mental note, Russell, I wanted to ask you about. What is going on with soccer games in Turkey? How come they are not respectful of what happened in Paris?
Of course, and the Parisian attacks were a tragedy, of course, and these moments of silence were actually during the Turkish national team's matches, of course, playing against other countries. And during the moment of silence, as you said, we had certain fans on the Turkish side chanting Allahu Akbar, which is God is great, and booing during this moment of silence. Certainly something you should respect. There are a lot of arguments that have to do with the fact that certainly there is still a hooligan element in Turkish soccer still. So a lot of these individuals really don't understand the word respect generally. But of course, there are politically active fans in the stadium that honestly recognize the irony and the hypocrisy of the West in terms of the reaction of these terrorist attacks. Because as we talked together, actually the last time we had a discussion, it was about the Ankara bombings. And yes, unfortunately, we didn't see any moments of silence, unfortunately, taken for any of the Turkish victims in European countries or in the United States. So I would probably have to preface that some of these fans, more politically active fans, certainly affiliated with the AKP party, certainly wanted to highlight that anger that they've been feeling.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's sad, because what it means to me is, aside from their essential loyalties, it means that the country is not together on an issue that it should be together on. I mean, as a putative member of the EU and all that, it seems clear that they ought to be at least sympathetic with France as a country that just lost 130 citizens in a brutal massacre. So it's a kind of an irresponsible thing,
exactly,
even if you assume the best about them. And I would assume the best about them, and the hooligan aspect does ring true. But how do you feel that people in Turkey are reacting to this? Because this, for some reason, I mean, I suppose it's numbers, but it's also Paris, which is iconic anyway. And it was a Friday night. It was people, you know what they say, everybody loves Friday night. Tout le monde aime, was it vendredi? No. Let's see. Lundi, mardi, mercredi, jeudi, vendredi. Tout le monde aime vendredi soir. They were out, going to theater and restaurants on Friday night, and this was a crashing violation. And so
exactly.
I'm just curious as to how the people in Turkey take that, because I'm sure they like Friday night also.
Of course. I mean, certainly, there are many Turks that feel the sadness as the Parisians do, and of course many countries in the West do, for the victims of the Paris attack. A lot of Turks knew people in the Ankara bombings, so they know this terror, this violence that's been gripping now the West. And as you said, Paris is a symbol of Western Europe. So really this attack isn't just on France itself and the French people, but on values and identities that we've really ingrained in ourselves from French culture, French political society. But of course, as we've seen in social media and in the larger media, this brand of Pray for Paris and Facebook statuses and Facebook profile pictures with the French flag, draped over people's pictures, has really disillusioned a lot of Turks, unfortunately, as well, because they feel that, like I said with the soccer fans, they feel that why do these people get this sort of this remembrance and this mourning when this happened to us and this happened to the people of Lebanon as well, but there was nothing for them. There was no Facebook safety check. There was no great worldwide mourning for our people and for the Lebanese people. Why is that? So it's really a double-sided coin here, where you have this feeling of great sorrow and regret, and then you also have these questions coming out of why aren't we as important as these people? Mm-hmm. So it's very interesting. It's
very interesting. Yeah, interesting looking at it. But in terms of Turkey being threatened, I mean, we're all threatened now. All of Europe is threatened, and if you watch CNN and Fox and what have you over the weekend, it's clear that a lot of law enforcement agencies in the U.S. Feel that the U.S. is threatened. But Turkey must feel all the more threatened. Turkey's right next to Syria. And so the commentators have said it's a shift in policy by ISIS. Instead of just taking small towns, instead of trying to focus on Iraq and Syria, now they're going global, and apparently they have the money through their oil pipeline to do that, although other commentators have said the money won't last. But I just wonder what kind of reaction you're getting from your friends in Turkey. Let's take a short commercial break where I can rephrase that when Russell's on the line, and we can continue the conversation.
I'm Donna Blanchard, and this is a ThinkTech commentary. I'd like to talk about Islamic State militants. In particular, let's talk about Sunni Muslim jihadists following the caliphate known as ISIS or ISIL. A caliphate is a form of Islamic government led by a caliph, a person considered a political and religious successor to the Prophet Muhammad and a leader of the Muslim community. ISIS declared itself a caliphate in June of 2014. ISIS means the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. Their aim is to build a new country consisting of Syria and Iraq and a few other Middle Eastern countries for Sunni Muslims. ISIL is the emerging term which recognizes that the group is now extending their influence beyond Iraq and Syria. The L stands for Levant, which is an approximate historical geographic term referring to a large area in the Eastern Mediterranean. ISIL is linked to Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and the Taliban, which also began in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and are dominant in Iraq and Iran. The Al-Shabaab in Somalia is tied to ISIL. The Boko Haram in Nigeria has taken a vow of fealty for ISIL. These groups have followers in the Philippines, Indonesia, China, Myanmar, Bangladesh, India, Turkey, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Egypt, France, the United Kingdom, the United States, and Canada, among others. They want to enforce their view of conservative Islamic traditions and values. Anyone not following these traditions and values is an infidel, and they don't want us around. How is it that they've grown so vastly and relatively quickly? Well, they are practicing some pretty brilliant tactics, appealing to the reptilian brain of the most likely candidates to join them and increase their strength. The reptilian brain is the rudimentary fight-or-flight governance center of the brain. When all is going well and our lives are comfortable, we don't access that center much. If you don't have regular access to basic life-sustaining necessities, if you live without physical safety or are an emotionally disconnected teen in Iraq or Iowa, you're probably spending some time in that reptilian brain. ISIL fighters are also recruiters. They're using social media like professionals, locating and luring disenfranchised, lost, and angry people. They offer solace, purpose, community, and care. They brag about their bloody battles on Twitter, and those who engage with appreciation, a favorite or retweet, are exactly the people ISIL recruiters want, and they engage with mind-blowing passion and immediacy. In Anna Errol's book, In the Skin of a Jihadist, a young journalist enters the ISIS recruitment network. She describes a seduction of such strength, tenderness, and care, it could be found in the romance section of the library. That reptilian brain exists in all of us, and ISIL recruiters know that. All they have to do is wait for it to show up, whether because of civil unrest, need for basic physical safety and security, or emotional neglect. So let's work to keep it under wraps. We do that initially with human necessities like food, water, and shelter for Rohingya refugees and victims of the Nepal earthquake, and both natural and unnatural disasters here at home. And we continue to quiet that reptile with education. Don't allow yourself to believe that ISIL is over there and we're immune. We're not. But we are not powerless either. I'm Donna Blanchard, and this has been a ThinkTech commentary.
Okay, we're back, we're live. We got Russell back on the line. It's Russell, Kekoa Koehler, and we're talking about the view from Washington. And Russell is a think tank person, and he's an intern. Want to talk about what your internship is? Well, it's frozen. We're not doing very well in terms of connecting with Russell. We'll take another break. We'll try one more time, and if we can't succeed, we'll go to a replay.
Hi, my name is Seymour Kazimirski. Welcome to Seymour's World. I do a commentary series, and this week's commentary series was supposed to be on Thanksgiving and what we are supposed to be thanking God for and all of our friends. But I had to change it because of what happened in France this week. I've titled this commentary, Is There a Final Solution to ISIS? In bringing terror to one of the world's most beloved cities, ISIS did far more than wreak devastation on Parisians out for a Friday evening. The coordinated attacks ensured that November 13th will assume a place in the pantheon of dates that are shorthand for barbarism. The violence left millions in France and beyond fearful, traumatized, and grasping for a response. And it demonstrated the group's willingness to attack civilians and targets, no matter how innocent or how soft. The attacks also ended any debate about ISIS's international ambitions. Just weeks ago, experts were divided about the group's desires, with some arguing that its focus was mostly local and that its efforts to build a caliphate in Iraq and Syria took precedence over attacks abroad. No longer. ISIS is now suspected of having, in short succession, brought down a commercial Russian airliner, launched major attacks in the heart of Beirut, and sown violence and mayhem across Paris. Perhaps the group wishes to impose a cost for interventions in Syria by France, Russia, and Lebanese Hezbollah. Possibly ISIS sees these countries and others as inevitable obstacles for the state-building project it envisions for the wider Middle East. Or maybe a program of catastrophic international terrorist attacks was part of the plan all along. It's hard to know precisely what motivates ISIS, but it would be folly to think that the U.S. will remain immune from its designs. America remains...
Okay, we're back. We're live through the magic of Skype, which works most of the time. And we have Russell Kekoa Koehler, who is our correspondent in Washington, because now he is an intern for the office of Senator Brian Schatz. And before, he was a think tank person in Istanbul. He is definitely a global citizen, and that's terrific. That's what we want here at ThinkTech. We want everybody to be a global citizen. So, you know, it's come to our attention anyway, in talking to the people we talk to, that ISIS is moving global too. And ISIS is, you know, doing aggressive things, obviously in France, but elsewhere in Europe. They're making threats in many places, including, you know, Europe and the US. And so that certainly must have, that cannot be lost on the people in Turkey. And I wonder if you have any contact with your, you know, your friends, associates, colleagues in Turkey about how people in Turkey feel about this change in strategy.
Of course, and you know, it's definitely a change of strategy towards you know, ISIS targeting those countries that are most heavily involved in Syria. It seems like we had the Russian airline that was blown up a couple weeks ago. We had the Ankara bombings. We had the Parisian attacks. We had the Beirut bombings. You know, and each of these is tied to a specific party that's involved in Syria right now. Beirut being Hezbollah, of course, Iran's connection in combat in Syria. The Russian airline, of course, we know, you know, Russia's been conducting airstrikes against ISIS in Syria. And Ankara, of course, because the Turks and the Kurds in Syria have been fighting against ISIS. So it's definitely something that is very scary for not only the West, but certainly Turkey, and certainly the Turkish Kurds that are afraid that as we get deeper into this fight with ISIS in Syria, you know, this organization is only going to become more desperate and more willing to attack other peoples, specifically innocent peoples, to create more fear and more panic around the world.
Yeah, they certainly are trying to do that now, and if you watch the media, seem to be having the desired effect. But it must be very intense in Turkey, because Turkey is, you know, close by. Turkey is accessible by ISIS, and at the same time, Turkey and Erdogan, they are pretty tough, and there's a pretty efficient army and police force in Turkey. They know how to enforce their will. And yet, this kind of strategy by ISIS can get around that. And that's a pretty scary thing for the average Turkish citizen. No matter how strong the army is, these continuing attacks go on unmitigated. And I suppose the same fear is now all through Europe, that you can have a big army. The police, they deployed over 100,000 policemen and army troops in Paris after that attack. I'm not sure whether the benefit was consummate with the number of people involved. And so the people in Turkey must be worried that they, and for that matter, their country, are at risk to continuing attacks. What have you heard?
You're absolutely right, and the fact that these attacks aren't, you know, necessarily, you know, coordinated military operations. These aren't the sort of attacks that, you know, the Turks have been dealing with in reference to the PKK, where, you know, you have these guerrilla operations where, you know, the operatives want to stay alive. I mean, these are operations in which consist of suicide bombings, where these people are sacrificing their lives. They do not care whether they live or die. And so it adds to the success rate, unfortunately, to these kinds of operations, which adds to the fear of these people, because it can happen anywhere, honestly. It can happen anywhere at any time. And it's an unfortunate thing, because especially for the people in Turkey, where the government is taking advantage of this sort of instability and the prospect of using terrorism as a means of growing the security apparatus in Turkey to limit the social liberties of Turks. It's a sad prospect, and honestly, it's the Turks, it's the Kurds, and unfortunately, it's the Syrian refugees who are taking the full brunt of these attacks.
Yeah, well, and now is this affected? I mean, we do have a change in strategy that has, that has had an impact on all of Europe, at least. But does this mean that does this overshadow the migrant, evolution? Has this affected the migrant evolution? Has it stopped the process or changed the process of migrants coming from Syria to the EU?
It does. It has an almost direct effect on the migrant issue, because what you have now is these seven attackers that conducted the operation in Paris. Two of them were found to have traveled into Europe from Syria. Now, these weren't Syrian refugees. They had fake Syrian passports. Every single one of the attackers were actually EU nationals, but it begged the question, could this happen, and could these individuals come through with the Syrian refugees? And so what we have in Europe is a growing number of nationalism and nationalist party. We'll probably see the revitalization in the next elections in that direction. And as we've seen in the United States, we've seen the political rhetoric of both parties, one pro, one against, more and more Syrian refugees coming over. Actually, it's quite interesting. One of the more outspoken proponents for creating a strengthened refugee process is actually Hawaii Representative Tulsi Gabbard. She actually voted. She's a House Democrat. She voted on a bill in Congress with House Republicans that actually makes it harder for refugees to resettle in the United States. Mm-hmm. So it's these attacks and these ISIS operations have a direct effect on the Syrian refugees, who are unfortunately, they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. It seems they flee this violence, this terror, only to go somewhere where a lot of people don't want them.
Yeah.
So it's a real sad reality.
Yeah. So they're the true victims. Well,
Exactly.
It strikes me though that until this happened in Paris, until this visible change in strategy, there was a dialogue going on in Europe about people, on the one hand, the liberals who wanted to, as a humanitarian thing, they wanted to take in as many migrants as possible. And, and then on the other hand, the conservatives who wanted to, bring the gate down and say no more. And interestingly enough, we have the same argument going on here in the U.S. at this point. But, what I think that argument has been affected by this change in strategy. That argument has been affected, the dialogue has been affected, by what happened in Paris and since Paris. And so probably the liberals are not in as persuasive a position anymore. And the conservatives may prevail here, at least in the short term, on bringing the door down so that the migrants really can't make any traction in terms of getting into Northern Europe. What do you think?
You're absolutely right. I mean, one of the easiest ways to rile people up is through fear, unfortunately. And some of that fear, a lot of that fear comes from these attacks directly. But some of that fear comes from the aftermath in these, in parties or individuals who, are able to, influence, the public or people to view Syrian refugees or these individuals in a more negative light. So what you have not only in the United States but in Europe is a lot of fear mongering. Unfortunately, there's evidence of racism, and unfortunately, if it continues, there will be a lot of ineffective policy in dealing with these subjects, and that ineffectiveness will lead to, unfortunately, greater radicalism and greater amounts of terrorism in the future.
Yeah, well, the new normal is certainly new, and the new normal is dealing with the risk that you or your friends or relatives could be killed anywhere for no reason, executed at random, and that's a new normal for sure. It's sort of like flying a plane, you know that the percentage is X amount. It's a small amount, but it's out there and exists, and people who fly planes, they know about it and they take the risk of it. Now I think we have another element like that you could be the victim of an ISIS attack, and that's the new normal. What are you going to do? So you go about your life the way the Israelis do, I suppose, putting that risk in your life, putting it in your worldview, and hoping that you're not the one. But you know what? This creates a conservatism, and it turns the whole focus sort of to the right, and there are people out there who say, nuke them all. Let's go and bomb and carpet bomb the whole area where they come from. Let's just kill them all. And you must hear that in Washington, and certainly it must be, fairly pronounced in Europe too, from the conservative side of things. And certainly American TV has plenty of it. And so there's a certain reaction to this, and the reaction will be visited not only in people who say nuke them, but to the political process that says we're going to take steps here. We're not going to let them in, or we're going to watch them more carefully. And on the level of the sort of city, neighborhoods, whatnot, the police will be more vigilant. I mean, there was a exercise in New York City over the weekend. I'm sure you heard about it, where the police were running around in this kind of, experimental, what do we do in case there's a terrorist attack? So people are reacting in various ways. And as you said, Russell, some of those ways may be inefficient, may not work, maybe over the top, who knows what. And we're doing trial and error now. And every time there's an attack, we'll try other things. And ultimately, I like your thought about this, ultimately, our world will change. If this keeps going, our world will change to deal with this new normal. What do you think about that?
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the goal of every terrorist attack is to create fear. And that fear is created in order to change a society, and unfortunately, liberal societies are the most susceptible to that change because we have representative governments which listen to the people, and unfortunately, the people themselves are very susceptible to fear. And so, what we have here in this country, as well as in Europe, is we start labeling, we start associating a small amount of people with a larger amount of people. And many commentators, many analysts, presidential candidates have said that this is what ISIS wants. They want us to be afraid. They want us to sacrifice our principles, our moral integrity in order to show how hypocritical we are, how we can turn into just anybody else. We can be scared to the point where we sacrifice everything, our history of our country. And that's one of the things that we need to prevent severely is we need to stick to our principles, and that includes Europe, especially includes the United States, in terms of accepting peoples that are poor or tired or hungry, like it says on the Statue of
Huddled
Liberty.
masses yearning to be free. Yeah,
Exactly.
that's true. And if you take my hypothetical down further, what you get is a kind of cyclical devolution, where you have the attack, you have the fear, you have the reaction, and then people get to accept it as the new normal. They become less concerned over time if there's no attack, no further attack, but then there's another attack. And the whole cycle starts up again. And over time, over a number of cycles, you wind up changing the society. And in the case of Europe, it's really sad because Europe has been so open. Europe has allowed people to come in. Europe has no boundaries, no borders. It's been a sort of a marvelous social experiment for the past, 20, 30 years, since the Berlin Wall came down, really. It's been fabulous, and now all those gains are at risk of reactionary barriers. And in the U.S., we've spent since 1789 trying to put together a humanistic country with the right principles and constitutional law and all that, and that will also be at risk. Look what happened with the Patriot Acts after 9/11, how we lost some civil rights. If we have an attack in this country, there'll be a further loss of civil rights. People, if I was in Washington like you, I'd be worried about it.
Exactly. I mean, and I think people really need to understand the realities of not only the plight of the Syrian refugees, but also the process by which they have to go through to even get into the United States. The Syrian refugees have to go through 2 screening processes just to get into the U.S. So they have to go through the first, which is the UN screening process, which labels them as a credible refugee. And then after 18 to 24 months of that UN process, they go through now the U.S. screening process, which includes personal interviews, medical evaluations, and security intelligence screenings. And so this process could take up to 2.5 people to get into the United States. It is the most difficult process of any people on Earth.
So it's going to be illusory. It is illusory. When
Exactly.
the Europeans were letting them in, there was nothing like that. Now we come up with process and structure that allows them a right that is illusory. They'll never get in that way. And I hope people realize that it's transparent. It's visible to all the world that we're not faithful to our own principles. Your point earlier, we have to be faithful to our own principles. We have to bring in tired and huddled masses yearning to be free and so forth. And I don't know, years of process is not the answer.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. I mean, it's unfortunate. And honestly, this bill that's now going through Congress, as I said before, is actually going to make that process even harder. It's actually going to force the U.S. Homeland Security and FBI director to have to certify every single Syrian refugee
Yes.
that completes that process. So they have to be certified on the desk of the director of the FBI and director of Homeland Security, which honestly is a waste of time when it comes to the very, very extreme difficulty of this process, vetting process. I mean, I read an article, earlier this week where it really satirically stated, if I was a terrorist, this would not be the way I would want to get into the United States. 2.5 years of waiting just to get into the U.S. to attack American society isn't very efficient. And so they actually labeled programs that are inefficient, that are national security deficiencies in the U.S., which is, if you're an EU citizen, you can get to the U.S. with one personal interview. All you have to do is get a U.S. visa and get through customs. That's it. And as we've seen in the Paris attacks, all of the Parisian attackers were EU nationals. They were all EU citizens.
Yeah.
And so that is where the problem lies, is strengthening our visa processes, not keeping homeless, hungry people out of this free country.
Well, the ISIS crowd is really trying to disrupt everything as terrorists and anarchists do. And the hard part is figuring out how to counter their moves. You know, what technology to use, what kind of different rules of engagement we need to deal with them, what kind of political will we need. You know, the whole issue about boots on the ground. It's a global village now, and it's hard to say that we can control this by remote control. We may have to simply go out there with boots on the ground, but the problem is getting the other countries to come along with us, you know, to develop a real alliance. An alliance, if you will, that would include even Russia, who has lots of reasons, especially after that plane, lots of reasons to join the alliance. If the countries of Europe and Russia and the US were allied on dealing with ISIS, I think that would be a solution, or at least lead to a good solution of the problem. But instead, it seems to me that we have international politics going on, and it's hard to create, you know, to mend the fragmentation. Any thoughts about the importance of an alliance? Any thought about what an alliance could do in order to protect us, all of us, from this kind of attack?
Oh, of course. I mean, greater international cooperation and coordination in defeating ISIS would, you know, certainly help to provide an effective downfall of the organization. And especially, it would definitely help with, you know, no mistakes during operations, such as friendly fire or shooting or some, you know, logistical mishaps. But it's interesting that you mentioned, especially Europe. France has always been a country that has been very protective over its sovereignty. And after this attack, President Hollande, you know, he called for a ruthless campaign against ISIS. And the French have actually conducted now, I believe yesterday, they conducted 14 airstrikes on the city of Raqqa in Syria. And they've actually brought forward a UN resolution they've called the UN Security Council to a meeting in order to potentially, you know, start a UN resolution on destroying this organization. Another possibility would be, you know, the NATO alliance invoking its Article 4 collective security clause.
Yes.
You know, so these options are on the table. And of course, Russia, having, as you said, faced this terrorist attack on its airline, killing over 200 Russian citizens, it's more in the fight now. Unfortunately, with all those gains in international cooperation, international coordination, as it seems that there will be in the next couple weeks, next months, hopefully next years, the main enemy of the Syrian people is going to remain in Syria, and that is Bashar al-Assad. So it's an unfortunate consequence that we have to sacrifice for pragmatism in order to defeat something that has been really internationally threatening.
Yeah. Well, I guess one question that comes to my mind is that, you know, this country has been inconsistent in its policy around Syria and ISIS and Iraq and all that over the past few years. And it has cost us credibility on the international stage. And I wonder if this country is still in a position to organize this international alliance that would conceivably, logically be able to address the ISIS problem and solve the ISIS problem. Any thoughts about what country or countries would lead this alliance if there were an alliance to be made?
You know, unfortunately, as it stands now, It has to be. It has to be the United States that at least brings together these different sets of countries into a more coordinated alliance, and that includes Arab countries such as Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states. That includes, Western European countries, which the UK, France, and even more European countries, as unfortunately these attacks will keep occurring, and bring in the Russian Federation into a more observational, maybe coordinated role on defeating ISIS, and compartmentalizing the relationship with Bashar al-Assad to a later date. So it really is left up to the United States to bring all of these parties together, because honestly, we're the only nation with the internal relations with each of these parties, with the Kurds, with the Sunni Arabs in this region, in order to get them to realize that this is something that they need to do.
Well, it certainly is a legitimate issue in the campaign now underway. Hard to say, which side it favors best. I think that the Democrats could certainly have the credibility to fashion an alliance. Hillary Clinton, as a former Secretary of State, comes to mind on that. On the other hand, the reactionaries would like to see some of the Republican rhetoric come true, and that would also have a big effect on the campaign. Don't know how people are reacting, in the country. And if there is an attack on our soil, that certainly will create a new kind of reaction and have even a more profound effect on the campaign. Any thoughts on that?
You're absolutely right about the different sorts of strategies that each candidate brings to the table. It's actually the candidates with the most foreign policy experience, which being on the Democratic side, Hillary Clinton, of States, former First Lady, and probably on the Republican side, you have Marco Rubio, Foreign Relations Committee, Intelligence Committee. He's a foreign policy expert. What's interesting is that both their plans for defeating ISIS are very, very similar. They are almost identically similar, in fact. And what that shows us is that if one of these individuals come in or not, that this could be a strategy that is brought forward, one of their strategies. Because if you have agreement on both sides, well, there has to be some truth to the method.
Hi, would we all be able to come together? Wouldn't it be so great? And find a way to create a one strategy policy and not fight about it. And the same thing with Europe, and then Europe and the US and Russia. It would be wonderful if we could come together. And maybe, ultimately this is going to get so bad that that's the only choice. But I have one more question for you, Russell.
Of course.
And it's a difficult question, and maybe you've thought about it. Maybe your time in Turkey would have helped. And that is, why in the world would ISIS do this? Why are they chopping heads off? Why are they killing people at random? Why are they engaged in a terrorist attack, senseless, murderous terrorist attack after attack? Why would any group do that? What could they achieve out of it?
You're absolutely right. It is a very, very difficult question. And I've read an article that even goes into the more ideological side of, can we even call this radical Islam? Should we call this radical Islam? Is it Islam? Certainly, the proponents of ISIS believe that they are forwarding some religious ideology, some caliphate. But millions, if not tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of Muslims around the world are disavowing these people, are saying that this is not Islam. These are barbarous terrorists. These are people that have taken something and used it for their own greed and for their own really sadistic grab of power. I mean, it's horrible what ISIS has been doing in Syria and in northern Iraq. As you said, the beheadings, the hostage taking, the execution videos, the propaganda on to European youth, to Arab youth around the world. It's a scary prospect, and I think it's very important to distinguish between ISIS and the religion that they think that they represent, because many Muslims in Turkey that I've known, that I'm very good friends with, as well as Muslims that I've known in Hawaii as well, you know, they say that, you know, these people, they don't know the religion, they don't know what they are doing, and you know, people can be good or bad, and it's up to their interpretation of the religion.
Yeah.
You know, that's what's important. And so it's a horrible, horrible thing what's going on right now.
Well, more to come. We'll do this again, okay, Russell? I'd like to stay in touch with you, and I'm sure there'll be events. It seems like the press is completely occupied with the issue, and we can talk again in a couple of weeks. Russell Kekoa Koehler, a Hawaii boy in Washington, D.C., an intern of a senator, federal senator, who has lots of experience in Turkey, having examined that society and what's going on there. Thank you so much, Russell.
Thank you.
Aloha.